And welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to take our first look at animation in Photoshop. Now, we are not going to yet have you get to the point of creating an animation because we first need to understand how an animation actually works. So to do that, I've created this very simple animation here, and I'm going to go ahead and play that just so you can see the animation as it moves. And you can see it's a very simple thing, just like a red ball bouncing up and down on a line. Nothing really too crazy here, but you can see it's very basic in what it does. Now, that being said, let's actually look at a couple things that we're going to need moving forward that's going to help us as we start examining things in a deeper lens. The first thing to understand is that we need this little thing down here called a timeline. Now, there are, of course, two different settings in timeline. There's video and there's frame rate. We, of course, are going to be working with frame animations here because we're working in a 2D pixel art space. And if we want to turn on or turn off the timeline, that's simply going here to Window, and then we can just check this little box for timeline. I can, of course, toggle that on and off very easily, and you can see it will keep my settings here for this animation. Additionally, we are going to have different layers here that we're going to end up using here to help create that animation. So if you aren't familiar with working with layers, we should be by this point, but we are going to need to be more comfortable than ever. And when we start working with layers, naming them appropriately, maybe even grouping them to kind of help us make our animations much more solid and consistent. Additionally, let's just go ahead and take a quick look here. You can see I have my layers labeled 1 through 8, which is corresponding to my 8 frames of animation. Now, that may not always be the case. We may have more complex layers that we're going to be using, but for the simple example, this works fine. So I have 8 different animations that I've created here through the different layers. And of course, I have 8 different animations that I have each here playing through the different frames. Now, one thing you will notice is each of these are set to 0 seconds here, which means there's no delay between changing from one frame to another. And we will look at that here in a future lesson of how to kind of change some things like frame rate and whatnot in order to kind of make an animation that might be faster versus an animation that might be slower. And of course, this is simply just one piece of it. Now, one thing I do want to point out, of course, is when we want to test our animation, you can see there's a nice little play button right here. There's also a kind of a step forward, step backward button here. So if I hit this one right here, it'll simply just take me to the next frame. It simply just moves to the next frame. This one takes me to the previous frame. And the nice thing is too, you can see it. There's also a kind of return to start button here. So if I am out, let's say at frame 5, and I click that button that's down here, it takes me back to the first frame. Now, there are of course other things in here that we can see. This allows us to add another frame. It's kind of like a little plus icon. We're very much like our layer icon that we're used to seeing. And of course, next to it is a trash can, which is our delete frame. So it allows us to easily, if we made a frame by accident, we say we want 10 frames of animation, and I accidentally made an 11th frame. Rather than trying to figure out how do I incorporate in the 11th frame, I can simply just delete that frame to take it out. Now, I will review this again here in the future as we move into this, but just to show you how to create these as GIFs, we are going to go ahead and hit File, Export, and Save for Web Legacy. This is one we haven't done yet to this point, but we're going to go ahead and click that here today. I'm not going to go too much in the settings because, again, we'll talk about this more here in the future. But the important thing to note is that we are in a GIF format here, so please make sure it's set to that. The rest of these settings are things that are a little bit more advanced than what we're going to be working with. But down here, the thing that you want to look for is animation, all right? And of course, it has looping options, all right? Looping options can either be set to once, forever, you can create your own. Typically, we're going to either set it to once or forever. Once simply means it's going to play the animation through once and then stop once it gets to the end. Whereas forever is going to create a looping animation, so it's going to play continuously. And this is something that was very prevalent, for example, in the early days of the web when people would create GIFs, and the GIF would just simply play over and over again. And then, of course, we can just save and hit done here. So we have a couple options here that we can work with. And again, we'll visit this here in the future when we start working more with this. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and cancel this. Again, this is a real quick way to see how to do this. Now, I'm not going to go too much into today of how to set all this up. I just want you to know that this is how it works. It's something very simple. It's not as complex as you might think. You might think, oh, this is super complicated. I'm going to have to do all these extra steps. And what I think you're going to find as we move into Photoshop here is that the animations that we're going to be working with, we're going to start simple in what we're creating, but the process is actually not as complex as you may fear it is.